The smell of old hotel carpet clings to the air as my son hands me trash bags, his eyes avoiding mine. Still, I stay calm, my fingers brushing the paper in my bag. As he shifts uncomfortably, I pull it out slowly, the document that removes him from my life, from everything he thought he'd inherit. While the weight of his betrayal settles in, I realize he never cared. That's when I hand him the paper, and my silence says it all. My son leaves, empty-handed. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret's hands tightened around the steering wheel as the old sedan hummed down the highway. The call had come an hour earlier. Jacob's voice clipped, with a tone she didn't recognize. Meet me at the motel. I need to talk. The words sat heavy, awkward, as if he were the one trying to hold back, unsure of how to face her. Margaret knew, deep down, it wasn't a conversation that would heal anything. It had been too long since any words between them had carried meaning. The motel loomed ahead, shabby and aged, a relic of another era. The flickering neon sign buzzed faintly in the twilight, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Margaret parked, she saw Jacob standing by the door to a room, his back turned, staring at something unseen in the distance. She couldn't place the expression on his face. Indifference, maybe. Or a strange mix of discomfort and relief? Margaret's breath caught as she stepped out of the car. Her heels clicked against the pavement, a sound that seemed too loud, too pointed in the quiet, empty lot. Jacob didn't turn as she approached. His body was stiff, his arms at his sides. She saw the plastic bags piled in front of him, bulging and uneven, like something hastily thrown together. The red and blue colors of the motel sign flickered above, casting an eerie glow on the scene. "Mom?" Jacob's voice broke the silence, low and almost rehearsed. He gestured to the trash bags with a hand that seemed disconnected from him, as if he were presenting her with something of little importance. "I'm just cleaning out some of your stuff. You know, to make room for easier living." Easier living. The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Margaret blinked, the sting of those words sinking deeper than she expected. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that he said it, or that he truly believed it. "You don't need all of it," Jacob added, glancing at her only briefly before looking away. There was no apology, no remorse. Just a hollow justification for something she hadn't asked for and would never accept. Margaret stood motionless, her heart drumming in her chest. The bags before her weren't just filled with belongings. They were filled with the weight of a betrayal so cold it made her bones ache. Her son, the one she'd raised, loved, and protected for 40 years, was standing here now, handing her trash. Behind him, Clara leaned against the wall of the motel, arms crossed, a smug smile playing at the corner of her lips. There was no warmth in her expression, only the satisfaction of someone who had already decided what was best for Margaret, whether Margaret agreed or not. Clara's eyes didn't meet hers. They just darted briefly to Jacob, as if signaling a silent approval of this strange, heartless ritual. Margaret felt a flicker of anger rise within her, but it was quickly smothered by a deeper, more overwhelming sense of loss. This wasn't just about what was in those bags. This was about everything that had led them here, the years of her sacrifices, the late nights spent trying to teach Jacob the things he should have learned, the moments when she'd believed in him, when she'd believed in family. Her voice remained steady, though every word felt like a battle. "I see." Jacob shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak, as if waiting for something. For a reaction, maybe. For the mother who'd always comforted him to show some sign of emotion. But she didn't. She only looked at him, looked at the man he had become, and the coldness that had wrapped around him like a second skin. A thin smile stretched across Clara's face. more mocking than genuine, and in that moment, Margaret saw it clearly. The alliance, the unity in their betrayal. The way they stood together, an unspoken understanding between them that Margaret would be left with nothing. Margaret's gaze flickered briefly to the pile of bags before her. Clothes, books, trinkets. What little she had left of a life she once knew. Her eyes stung, but she blinked back the tears. There would be no tears here. Not in front of him. Not in front of Clara. She spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I'll make my own arrangements," she said, her words like a quiet dismissal. Jacob didn't answer. He seemed almost relieved by her lack of resistance. He wasn't looking for an argument, after all. Not anymore. Margaret could almost hear his thoughts. She'll just take the bags, she'll complain for a bit, but eventually, she'll accept it. She always did. But not this time. Her eyes didn't waver from Jacob's face. "You can leave now." There was no confrontation, no loud fight, just the unspoken truth hanging between them. The truth of what he had done. What they had both done. Jacob didn't argue. He simply turned away, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the pavement as he walked back to the car, leaving her standing there with the trash bags, Clara's laughter still echoing faintly in the air. Margaret stood for a long moment, watching the space between them grow, the distance that could never be bridged again. The drive back home was a blur, the headlights of passing cars slicing through the darkened road like sharp knives. Margaret's grip on the wheel was tight, her fingers numb as if they belonged to someone else. The air inside the car felt too still, too quiet. Every thought in her mind swirled in a fog of disbelief and anger, each memory of the past hour more painful than the last. Jacob's face, his cold indifference, kept flashing before her eyes, followed by Clara's smirk, the one that had been a silent agreement between them. This was how it was now. She parked in the driveway without even realizing she'd pulled up. The house loomed before her, silent, untouched, as it always had been, but now it felt alien, as if she didn't belong there anymore. It was a place that should have felt like home, but now only made her feel like an intruder in her own life. Margaret sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door. The old oak tree in the front yard swayed gently in the wind, its branches reaching out like twisted arms. Her phone buzzed. Jacob. She looked at the screen, the text blinking back at her like a challenge. "I didn't mean it the way you think. Please, let's talk." The message was so typical of him, apologetic, trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. She opened the text, fingers hovering over the screen for a moment. She had been about to call him, to tell him exactly how she felt, to demand an explanation, to force him to see the wreckage of what he had done. But as she stared at the screen, she realized something. There was no point. No words would change anything. He'd made his choice. And now, so would she. She deleted the message without replying. Instead, she reached for the home phone on the passenger seat, her fingers trembling as she dialed Vera's number. She needed to talk to someone who would understand, who wouldn't try to soften the blow with empty words. Vera had been a lifeline for so long. The phone rang twice before Vera's voice came through, steady and warm, despite the late hour. "Margaret, you all right?" Margaret didn't even try to hold back. "No," she said, her voice strained. He handed me trash bags. My own son, handing me trash bags." Vera's silence on the other end spoke volumes. Then, after a pause, her voice softened, but with a quiet urgency. "It's time to take control, Margaret. You're not a victim in this. Not anymore." The words cut through the fog in Margaret's mind like a sudden light. Take control. How many years had she spent trying to hold on, to protect him, to give him everything she had, even when he didn't deserve it? How many times had she told herself that family was the most important thing? How many more chances would she give to someone who clearly no longer saw her as part of their world? I know, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, but it's so hard. You're stronger than this, Vera replied, her voice firm. You don't need him. And you sure as hell don't need Clara. Do what you need to do for you. Margaret's chest tightened. She thought of the house they had lived in, of all the things she had sacrificed, of all the moments she had tried to create some sense of family out of nothing. But now, it was clear. She had to cut them off. And it had to start with her will. I'll make the call tomorrow, Margaret said, her voice clearer now, a sense of resolve starting to build within her. I'll get it sorted. You don't have to talk to him anymore, Vera added, her tone leaving no room for argument. You're not obligated to explain yourself, not to him, not to Clara. They don't deserve that. Margaret sank into the worn leather seat, her head leaning back against the headrest. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence fill the car, the weight of her decision settling in. She would change her will. She would remove Jacob and Clara from her life in every way she could, starting with the inheritance that had once felt like something they'd all share. It wasn't about money. It was about control, about reclaiming the last shred of dignity she had left. As she ended the call, another message from Jacob popped up on the screen. I know this is hard, but we're family. Don't shut me out. Margaret stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the screen. She could feel the rawness of the betrayal still fresh in her mind, the way he'd looked at her, like she was nothing more than a burden to be discarded. The truth of it all was undeniable. Her thumb moved. She tapped the trash icon. She wasn't going to reply. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. The silence in the car felt louder now, as if the entire world was holding its breath. She stared at the empty screen, feeling an odd sense of peace settle over her. It was the first time in years she wasn't trying to make things right for someone else. Margaret took a deep breath and stared out the windshield. It was done. There was no going back now. But as she sat there in the stillness of the night, a new feeling began to rise inside her. Something sharper, more electric than the pain. Something that felt like power. And it terrified her. The air in Margaret's house felt too thick, too heavy, like the weight of years of decisions pressing down on her shoulders. The blinds were drawn, and the only light that filtered through the slats was a faint gray morning glow, the kind that made everything feel like it belonged in a dream or a nightmare. She stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the worn counter as she stared at her phone. She had made the decision, and now she had to act. There was no going back. The phone in her hand felt foreign, like it didn't belong there. Her thumb hovered over Tom Richards's number for a moment before she pressed it, the vibration a jolt that made her heart race. The call rang twice before his calm, authoritative voice answered. "Margaret, how are you?" he asked, a note of genuine concern in his tone. "I'm ready," she said, her voice almost a whisper, as if saying it aloud would make it too real. "I need to make some changes. The will. I want to remove Jacob and Clara." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Tom spoke again, his voice steady, but with the experience of someone who had navigated such waters many times. "I understand. It's a tough decision. But it's your right, Margaret. I'll help you with it." The process, Tom explained, wasn't complicated. They'd need to draft a new will, a trust that would secure her wishes for the future. Everything Jacob and Clara had once assumed would be theirs would now go to Grace, her granddaughter, the only person left in this world who had shown her unconditional love. Margaret's chest tightened as she listened. She had never imagined it would come to this. That her own son, her only child, would turn into someone she couldn't trust. She thought back to the old days, when Jacob had been young, when she'd believed in family, when she'd worked tirelessly to raise him, to make him a man who could one day carry on the legacy she and her late husband had built. Those days felt so far away now, like they belonged to someone else. "I want to leave everything to Grace," Margaret said finally, her voice stronger now, clearer. "She deserves it. She's the only one who's shown me any real love, any real respect." Her eyes flickered to the family photos on the wall, the ones of Jacob as a child, his cheeky smile and the wild curls that used to remind her of his father. "I won't have them turning her into their next target," Tom agreed, outlining the steps they would take to ensure the inheritance was protected. He explained the process of putting everything into a trust, with Grace as the primary beneficiary. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just that. She knew better than to leave room for future challenges. "I want a no-contest clause," she added, her voice firm, as if the words themselves could solidify her resolve. "I want to make it clear that if anyone tries to challenge this will, they get nothing. No exceptions." Tom paused for a moment, then agreed. "That's the best way to ensure peace of mind. No one will be able to fight it if they try." Margaret felt a small flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. There was still so much to do, so many decisions to make. The betrayal of Jacob and Clara had left deep scars, but it had also made her realize something important. She was not powerless. Not anymore. After the call, she spent the rest of the morning going through the old files and documents that had sat untouched for years. Bills, insurance papers, and records of things she had thought were too difficult to revisit. She felt as though she were digging through the rubble of her life, unearthing the remnants of a past that no longer fit with who she was becoming. But there was something freeing about it too. Something empowering in reclaiming control over what was left. She had made the decision, and now she had to follow through. Vera came by in the afternoon, as promised, to help her sort through everything. As Margaret opened the drawer where her husband's old papers were kept, his handwriting still scrawled in the margins of letters, his signature on the official documents, the weight of the past hit her again. She could almost feel his presence beside her, as if he were silently watching, asking what had happened to the family they had both fought so hard to build. Vera stood quietly by, offering nothing but a steady presence, as if she knew better than to try and soothe the rawness that was unfolding inside Margaret. Together, they gathered the papers, meticulously documenting each item that would go into the new will, making sure everything was in order. Vera's voice was soft, encouraging when necessary, but she knew that this wasn't about comfort. This was about action. "You're doing the right thing," Vera said, as she watched Margaret carefully arrange the papers in a folder. "This is about you now, not them." Margaret nodded, but the words didn't have the same weight they once did. She was no longer afraid to let go. She was no longer afraid of the fallout. The silence between them stretched on, filled with the weight of the decisions being made. And just as they finished organizing the documents, Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Jacob. It was simple. Just 2 words. "Please, Mom." Her hand froze over the phone, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the world felt very small, and the space between her and Jacob felt like an entire lifetime. But Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she slid the phone back into her pocket. There was nothing more to say. And as she watched Vera organize the papers one last time, her resolve hardened. The family she had known was gone, but the future, her future, was finally in her hands. The cancer support group met every Tuesday, a small circle of chairs in a church basement that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. It was a place Margaret had come to count on, a refuge where the air didn't hold the same weight of family expectations, where no one was pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. For years, the group had been a constant, a source of strength she never expected to find, full of women who knew what it meant to fight, to survive. The diagnosis wasn't the hardest part. It was the isolation that followed, the feeling that you were left alone, even in the midst of your own family. Today, the group felt different. Margaret felt different. As she walked in, she noticed the familiar faces. Betty, with her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, as bright and stubborn as ever. Diane, who always wore a scarf tied loosely around her neck, the reminder of her own battle still evident on her skin. They greeted her warmly, their smiles softening the heaviness of the past week. But even their comforting presence couldn't fill the quiet void that had been growing inside her. She took a seat in the circle, adjusting her cardigan around her shoulders, the fabric soft against her skin. The room hummed with a quiet energy, the kind that only survivors understood. Conversations ebbed and flowed, but Margaret wasn't interested in joining just yet. She had come for a reason, to finally speak the words she had been holding in. When it was her turn, she cleared her throat, the words coming slowly, as though they'd been buried under too many layers of hurt. I've been dealing with something else, she began, the vulnerability hanging between her and the others. Something that has nothing to do with cancer but feels just as painful. My son and my daughter-in-law, She paused, feeling the lump in her throat, but she didn't allow herself to falter. She was tired of hiding behind silence. They've turned their backs on me, and I don't know how to reconcile that. The room fell still, every woman's eyes on her. Some had already heard pieces of her story, others were hearing it for the first time. Margaret wasn't sure what she was expecting. Sympathy, maybe, or some kind of understanding. Instead, what she got was something unexpected, a quiet strength, an unspoken understanding that these women had lived through their own betrayals, their own heartaches. Betty, who had always been the first to speak in the group, leaned forward, her eyes steady. "That's not family," she said, her voice low but firm. "That's just ego." Margaret blinked, the words cutting through the fog in her mind. Ego. She had never thought of it that way, but it made perfect sense. Jacob and Clara hadn't been thinking about her. They'd been thinking about themselves, their own desires, their own convenience. They'd stripped away the very thing that had held her to them, the idea of family. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Diane's voice joined Betty's, softer but just as resolute. Family doesn't do that to each other. Family doesn't make someone feel small, like they don't matter. And it doesn't do it just because it's easier for them. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. She hadn't known she needed to hear those words until now. They weren't just offering her validation, they were giving her permission to let go, to stop fighting for something that had already been lost. She looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the women who had become her surrogate family. "I just don't know what to do with this feeling," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I feel so discarded. And yet, I know I have to move on. I have to let go." The women nodded in unison, each offering her their own form of silent support. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about learning how to live with it. Margaret could feel their strength, a collective force that began to fill the empty spaces inside her, the ones Jacob and Clara had left behind. As the meeting continued, Margaret found herself talking less. Instead, she listened, really listened, as the other women shared their own stories, their own losses, their own fights. She took comfort in their words, their resilience, and in the fact that they understood. They weren't offering pity or empty platitudes. They were offering something far more valuable: solidarity. When the meeting ended, Margaret stood up, feeling lighter in a way she hadn't in days. Betty caught her arm on the way out. "You're not alone, Margaret," she said, her eyes soft but knowing. "You've got us." The words, simple as they were, felt like a balm on the rawness that had been exposed. Margaret smiled, a real smile, and nodded. That evening, as Margaret sat in her chair by the window, the familiar quiet of the house wrapping around her like an old blanket, she heard her phone buzz again. Her heart clenched as she saw the name on the screen. Jacob. Her finger hovered over the screen for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. She had heard from him so many times in the past few days. Apologies, half-hearted attempts to fix things, messages that were all too familiar. He didn't understand what had shifted. He didn't understand that it wasn't just about the bags or the will. It was about trust, about respect, about a lifetime of silence finally being broken. The message from Jacob was simple. "I'm sorry, Mom. Please let's talk." Margaret stared at the message, the familiar tug of guilt pressing at her chest. But she didn't respond. Not this time. Instead, she locked the phone and set it down, her thoughts returning to Grace. Her granddaughter's face, sweet and earnest, filled her mind. Grace was the one who had shown her what it meant to be loved, truly loved. As Margaret thought about the road ahead, she realized something that filled her with unexpected hope. It was her choice now. No one could take that from her. No one would. The office smelled faintly of leather and paper, the scent of permanence. Margaret sat at the polished mahogany desk, her fingers lightly grazing the edges of the documents in front of her. The weight of the decision she had already made seemed to settle around her like a heavy cloak. But there was no turning back now. She'd never expected to be here. Not like this. Her hands, usually steady, now trembled slightly as she reached for the pen, feeling the cool metal between her fingers. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Tom Richards, the estate attorney who had guided her through the legal process, sat across from her, his eyes watching her with quiet patience. He didn't need to say anything. He knew what this moment meant. The air around them felt thick, charged with an unspoken understanding. Jacob and Clara were gone as far as she was concerned. This was her future, and it was time to make it official. Margaret glanced at the clock on the wall. 2 minutes past noon. The appointment had been set for weeks, but even then, she hadn't fully understood the gravity of what she was about to do. It wasn't just about the money or the things. It was about control, about reclaiming what little she had left. "Ready when you are," Tom said softly, his voice almost like a reassurance. He didn't need to prompt her, but his calm presence had been a lifeline through this storm. Her eyes flickered to the papers in front of her. The new will was comprehensive. Every detail had been carefully considered, every aspect legally secured. Grace would inherit everything. The trust activated on her 21st birthday, ensuring that she would be cared for without interference. The rest, what little was left, would be directed to charity. The family heirlooms, once meant for Jacob, now held no significance as family gifts. They had become symbols of a time that no longer existed. The old watch that her husband had once worn, the silver candlesticks that had been passed down for generations, would all go to foundations that would use them for something good, something more meaningful. Margaret's fingers hovered over the page, the pen shaking ever so slightly. She felt the weight of her late husband's memory, the man who had shared her dreams, her hopes, and her love. This was the life they had built together, and now it was in her hands to protect what remained. Tom watched her closely. "There's a clause in here," he said, tapping a specific section of the will with a gentle finger. "A no-contest clause. You're sure about this?" Margaret nodded, her voice quiet but firm. "Yes. No one gets anything if they try to contest this. Not Jacob, not Clara, not anyone." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but they were the truth. She'd spent so many years trying to make things right, trying to salvage what was left of her family, but there was nothing left. There was only what she had built on her own, and she would be damned if they tried to tear it down now. Tom made a note on his pad and looked back up. Very well. Once you sign, this will be legally binding. Margaret took a deep breath, the weight of the pen in her hand symbolizing more than just ink on paper. This was a line in the sand. She had crossed it, but now she had to make sure it was final. With a steady hand, she signed her name at the bottom of the page, the smooth motion feeling strangely liberating. It was over. Jacob and Clara were officially out. There was no going back. As she set the pen down, a strange sense of peace washed over her, as though a door had finally closed behind her. She hadn't expected to feel this way. She hadn't expected to feel relieved. But there it was. Vera, who had quietly observed the entire process from the corner of the office, approached with a camera. Her face was serious but supportive as she snapped photographs of the signed documents, ensuring that every aspect of the will was legally protected. It was an added precaution, Margaret's way of making sure there would be no surprises down the line. "You're doing the right thing," Vera said softly, her voice carrying a weight of its own. Margaret had needed her steady presence these past few weeks, and now, as they looked over the documents together, Vera's words were the final seal of affirmation. Margaret nodded, the flood of emotions that had been threatening to break through for days finally settling. She felt a quiet strength rising within her. This wasn't just about her inheritance. This was about reclaiming her life, her legacy, and her peace of mind. But as they finished packing up the documents, Margaret's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Jacob, her heart clenched at the sight of his name. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know what happened to us. Can we talk?" For a moment, Margaret sat still, the phone glowing on the table in front of her. She knew what he wanted: a conversation, an explanation, maybe a chance to make things right. But she didn't respond. Instead, she looked up at Vera, who had caught the glance. Vera's eyes spoke volumes, and Margaret felt something shift within her. This was the moment. There was no going back. "Nothing more to say," Margaret said softly, as if confirming her own decision aloud. With that, she powered off the phone, a final act of severing the last thread of hope she had left for reconciliation. Jacob and Clara's chapter was closed, and Margaret's new life, the one she had fought for, was just beginning. Margaret heard the knock on her door just as she was settling into her chair with a cup of tea. The house was still, quiet, almost eerily so after the chaos of the past weeks. It had been a long time since the sound of a knock had carried any sense of warmth or expectation. She set the cup down slowly, the steam curling into the air, and rose from her chair. For a moment she stood still, the silence hanging thick around her like a blanket. Then the knock came again, more insistent this time. She walked to the door, her steps deliberate, but her pulse had quickened, just slightly. The moment before opening the door stretched long, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. She knew who it was. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and opened the door. Jacob stood there, awkward and hesitant, holding a bag of groceries in his hands. His eyes flickered to hers, then down to the ground, as if trying to measure the distance between them. The smell of fresh bread and fruit wafted through the doorway, a stark contrast to the tension that crackled between them. "I brought some food," Jacob said, his voice tentative, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "I thought we could talk. I'm really sorry, Mom, about everything, about how things ended up." Margaret didn't say a word. She just looked at him, letting the silence stretch between them. Jacob shifted awkwardly, trying to read her expression, but Margaret remained still. The years of love and patience she had given him, the years she had spent trying to fix things, were all gone now. They had evaporated with the last of his trust. What was left was a man standing at her doorstep, offering her food. Food she didn't want, from a person she no longer recognized. She stepped back, letting him in, but she didn't invite him further. The door clicked softly behind him as he stepped inside, carrying the bag with the kind of hope Margaret hadn't felt in so long. Jacob set the bag down on the counter, glancing at Margaret as he did. He seemed to be searching for the right words, the right gesture to bring back whatever had been lost. But Margaret couldn't give him that. She couldn't pretend that what had happened was something they could talk through. Not anymore. He stood there for a moment, his hands awkwardly hanging by his sides, waiting for a sign. But Margaret didn't give him one. She simply watched him, her gaze cool, unyielding. Finally, after a long pause, Jacob cleared his throat and took a step toward the small dining table. "I've been thinking about everything, and I know I've been a bad son. I should have done more, should have." Margaret's voice, when it came, was quiet, but firm. "You've done enough," Jacob faltered. He had expected something, anything, different. Maybe an apology from her, maybe a response to his regret. But all he received was an icy wall of silence. The moment stretched on, thick with the things unsaid. Behind him, through the window, Margaret could see Clara standing by the car in the driveway. She was leaning against the door, arms crossed, watching them through the glass. But Margaret didn't acknowledge her. She didn't turn to glance in her direction. Clara wasn't part of this anymore. Jacob shifted his weight, his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He took a hesitant step forward, as if to sit down, but Margaret's cold silence stopped him. She could see it in his face. He was waiting for the moment when everything would go back to what it was, when he could be forgiven, when she would make it better. But Margaret was done waiting. She had waited long enough. "I've already eaten," she said, her voice low but unyielding. Jacob blinked, his brows furrowing in confusion. He didn't understand. How could she have eaten? He hadn't even been gone that long. "I'm not hungry," she continued, her voice quieter now, but still sharp. "Not for anything you're offering." Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She was simply done. Jacob stood there for a moment staring at her, unsure of what to do next. He opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, Margaret turned away from him, walking back toward her chair by the window. She didn't need to hear anything else. There was nothing left to say. He watched her for a long moment, the heavy silence between them growing thicker with every passing second. Then, after a pause that stretched on far too long, he sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said one last time. But Margaret didn't respond. She didn't turn back. Instead, she sat in her chair by the window, staring out at the fading light of the evening, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settling around her. Jacob stood there, a silhouette in the doorway, but she didn't look at him. There was no need. Finally, Jacob left, his footsteps growing fainter as he walked down the driveway. Margaret remained still, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where the last traces of daylight slipped away, leaving only the quiet of the night. She had done it. She had cut the ties that bound her to the past. And now, for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she could finally breathe. The sound of the computer keyboard clacking under Margaret's fingertips felt strangely satisfying. Each tap, each stroke, was a release, a quiet rebellion against the years she had spent hiding her pain, swallowing the injustice, pretending things were okay when they were anything but. Today, the silence of her house no longer felt suffocating. It felt like freedom. She sat at the small desk by the window, her old laptop open in front of her. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of pink and purple, a reminder that the world continued, indifferent to the turmoil inside her walls. Margaret looked out at the scene for a moment, taking in the peaceful view. But there was nothing peaceful about what had happened between her and her son. And there was nothing peaceful about how she had lived in denial for so long. The decision had been made. She was done being silent. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keys as she typed the title of her new blog, Breaking Free, One Woman's Journey. She paused for a moment, the weight of the words settling on her chest. One woman's journey. She wasn't just writing about what had happened between her and Jacob and Clara. This was about reclaiming her life, her voice, her autonomy. It was about telling her truth, without apology. As she began to write, she found the words pouring out of her, each sentence an acknowledgement of the hurt and betrayal she had endured, but also a testament to the strength she had found in herself. She didn't name Jacob or Clara, not directly, but the story was clear enough. Anyone who had experienced betrayal, who had been thrown aside by family, would recognize the pain she was writing about. Margaret wrote about how she had given so much of herself, how she had always put others first, how she had sacrificed to keep her family together, only to be discarded when it no longer suited them. She finished the post with a simple, quiet statement. Sometimes, the people you love most are the ones who will hurt you the most, but it is in their absence that you find yourself again. Her fingers hovered over the publish button for a moment, and then, with a steady hand, she clicked it. The words were out there now. There was no taking them back. The world would see them. And Margaret wasn't going to hide anymore. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen for a moment. The quiet stillness of the room settling around her. It wasn't an act of vengeance. It wasn't an attempt to hurt Jacob or Clara. But it was an act of liberation. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of the betrayal lifting, even if only a little. The first few comments trickled in slowly. Strangers sharing their own stories of betrayal, of family fractures. One woman wrote, "I've been there. I know exactly how you feel. Thank you for sharing your story." Another commented, "This gave me the courage to walk away from my own toxic family. Thank you for your bravery." The messages weren't large in number, but they were powerful. They resonated with her. And for the first time in so long, Margaret felt seen. Not as a victim, not as a woman discarded, but as someone whose pain had meaning. Then, just as she was about to close the laptop and begin her evening routine, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was Jacob. Of course. She hesitated before looking at the message. It was short, terse. "What the hell is this?" the text read. "You're airing our dirty laundry on the internet? Do you have no shame?" Margaret's fingers clenched around the phone for a moment, but she didn't let the anger rise. Not this time. She wasn't going to be dragged back into the cycle of guilt and regret. She had done nothing wrong. This was her story, her truth, and she had every right to tell it. She opened the message and typed her response with calm, deliberate precision. "If the shoe fits, wear it." She hit send. For a moment there was nothing but the quiet hum of her phone, the stillness of the house around her. Jacob would likely respond. He'd probably try to make it about how she was ruining the family or acting out of spite. But Margaret had stopped caring about his opinions. She had stopped caring about what they thought of her. As the evening stretched on, the messages from Jacob didn't come. Not at first. But as she sat in the silence of her house, her eyes falling on the phone every so often, she felt something stir inside her. A calm certainty. She was done with the games, done with the guilt trips. She was finally free. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated her face as she opened her blog again. The post had been shared a few times, gaining traction with each passing minute. She wasn't sure where this would lead or who would read it next, but she felt something. Something that had been missing for years, shifting inside her. Then her phone buzzed again. It wasn't Jacob. It was another comment on her post. "Thank you for speaking the truth. You gave me the courage to finally stand up to my own family. We don't have to accept their abuse anymore." Margaret smiled. A real smile, the first she'd smiled in days. Her journey was just beginning. The room was packed with people. The air was thick with quiet anticipation, but Margaret felt strangely calm. The familiar hum of voices, the shuffle of feet, the sound of chairs being pulled out. All of it faded as she took the stage. It was a small local event, a gathering of cancer survivors who had banded together over the years. But for Margaret, this wasn't just another support meeting. This was her moment. The microphone stood before her, waiting, like the stage, like the world, ready to listen. She adjusted it slightly, the cool metal cold beneath her fingertips. As the crowd settled, she took a deep breath, her heart beating steady in her chest. This wasn't about cancer, not today. It had been a while since Margaret had felt truly seen, a while since she had allowed herself to be vulnerable in front of others. But now, she wasn't hiding anymore. Her blog had taken off in ways she hadn't anticipated, people sharing their own stories of betrayal, of fractured families. And now, here she was, ready to stand before a room full of strangers and tell her truth. She glanced around the room briefly, noticing familiar faces: Betty from the support group, Diane, others she'd known over the years. Their presence comforted her, but it was the eyes of the strangers in the crowd that drew her in now. Their faces were open, their expressions kind, waiting for the story she had to tell. Margaret's voice was steady as she began. "Sometimes," she said, her words deliberate, "the hardest thing to do is not survive, but to forgive. And for so many years I tried to forgive. I tried to be the mother, the grandmother, the woman who could fix everything. I tried to believe that love could heal all things, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most." The room was silent, hanging on her words. Margaret's eyes flickered over the crowd, but she didn't look for approval. She didn't need it anymore. What mattered was that she was finally telling the truth, her truth. "I raised my son. I gave him everything. And when it came time for him to step up, he chose the easy way out. He chose to discard me, to abandon me without even a second thought. And I let him do it. For too long, I let him. But that's not my fault. And I'm not going to keep hiding behind the belief that I should have done more, because I did everything I could." Her voice cracked only slightly, but she didn't hesitate. She was stronger now, stronger than she had been in years. "Jacob and Clara took everything from me, and they didn't even have the decency to look back. But it's not about them anymore. It's about me. It's about what I've learned through this journey. I'm not a victim. I'm not broken. I'm here." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. It felt like a release, a shedding of the skin she had been trapped in for so long. "I'm here to tell you that it's okay to let go. It's okay to break free from the people who hold you down. Even if they're family, you don't owe anyone your peace. And if they don't respect that, if they don't see you for who you are, then it's time to move on. It's time to take back your life." There was a long moment of silence after she finished speaking. Margaret stood tall, looking out at the faces in front of her. She wasn't expecting applause, but she felt the shift in the room, the understanding, the empathy, the relief. And then, just as she was about to turn to step down from the stage, she noticed them. Jacob and Clara, sitting in the back, not far from where Betty and Diane were. Clara's face was stiff, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Jacob sat beside her, his eyes cast downward, avoiding the gaze of the crowd. Margaret didn't need to look long to know what they were feeling. They couldn't even look her in the eye. A small, bitter smile tugged at Margaret's lips. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But she didn't look away. She kept her eyes fixed on them, refusing to let their presence derail her. This was her moment. This was her truth. They couldn't take that away from her anymore. She stepped off the stage and made her way back to her seat, her heart light despite the eyes on her, despite the tension in the room. Grace, sitting quietly in the back row, caught her eye and gave her a small, proud smile. Margaret's heart swelled. Grace was her anchor now, the one person who had stood by her through everything. Her granddaughter's quiet support meant more than any apology Jacob could offer. As Margaret settled back into her seat, the conversation around her began to pick up again. People were talking about what she had said, sharing their own stories, offering their own insights. Her words had made an impact. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her truth had resonated with others who had been silenced, who had suffered in the shadows of their families' secrets. But then, as the evening wore on, Margaret's phone buzzed in her bag. She reached for it, her fingers already anticipating the inevitable. It was a message from Clara. "Family support is the most important thing," Clara's text read. "We can't let one person destroy it." Margaret stared at the message, a hollow feeling creeping into her chest. Clara was still trying to make this about family, about the facade of family. The words rang hollow, empty. Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she put the phone down and looked around at the people she had connected with tonight. These were her people now. These were the ones who understood. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The air in the treatment center felt charged with an electric stillness, almost reverent. The bell sat before Margaret just a few feet away, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was a simple thing, made of brass, worn from years of use. But to her, it felt monumental. A symbol of survival, of fighting through the darkest moments and coming out the other side. She had been waiting for this moment, imagining it in the quiet of her home, in the solitude of her mind. The moment when she could ring that bell and leave the past behind. But now that she stood there, with her hand hovering over the rope, a sudden emptiness washed over her. No one was here to witness it. No one she cared about, at least. Jacob and Clara hadn't shown up. She hadn't expected them to. They hadn't supported her through her treatments, hadn't cared when she was sick, hadn't even bothered to reach out in the days before. When the nurses had told her that the moment of remission was near, there had been a fleeting hope in her that they might come, that they might realize what they had lost and try to make things right. But the silence from their side remained just that, silent. Margaret's fingers curled around the rope, the cool metal comforting under her hand. The bell would ring, but it wouldn't be for them. It wouldn't be for anyone who had failed her. It was for her. She pulled, feeling the satisfying weight of the brass ring. The sound echoed in the room, a triumphant loud peal that reverberated in her chest like a drumbeat. Her heart raced, but the emptiness remained. No one clapped, no one cheered. But she didn't need that. She had long since realized that her victories were hers alone to claim. Margaret turned and walked away from the bell, her shoulders straight, her steps firm. She had walked through this journey alone, and now she would walk forward in the same way. Outside, the bright sunlight felt like a new beginning, a fresh chapter waiting to be written. But as she sat in her car and reached for the envelope resting beside her, A familiar weight settled in her stomach. It was a card from Grace, her granddaughter. The simple blue envelope held a message that made Margaret's heart swell in ways she hadn't expected. "You were always stronger than it." She read the words again, her vision blurring for a moment. Grace had been the one light in her life, the one person who had never failed her, who had never tried to manipulate or use her. Grace was the only one who truly understood, who saw her for who she was, strong, capable, and worth fighting for. Margaret tucked the card into her purse, feeling a quiet smile pull at the corners of her lips. She wasn't alone. Not really. The days after her remission were quiet. She had no need for grand celebrations or public acknowledgments. The victory was personal. She celebrated in her own way, in the stillness of her home, in the quiet spaces where only she could hear the echo of her triumph. She had come through this. She had survived. Vera came by that evening, a bottle of wine in hand. The two of them raised their glasses in the dim light of Margaret's living room, a simple, intimate toast to survival. "To you," Vera said softly, her eyes meeting Margaret's across the table. "To the woman who finally found her strength." Margaret smiled, the weight of the years lifting, even just a little. "To the truth," she replied, her voice steady. "To breaking free." They clinked glasses, the sound ringing in the stillness, as if marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another. A few weeks later, Margaret's life took another unexpected turn. Her blog, Breaking Free, One Woman's Journey, had gained an audience. What started as an act of catharsis had become a movement. The stories she shared resonated deeply with others. Women and men alike reached out, telling her their own tales of betrayal, family fracture, and recovery. Her words had become a lifeline for so many. Her blog turned into something larger than she ever imagined. A book deal came knocking, an offer she accepted without hesitation. Breaking Free, A Survivor's Guide, became a bestseller within weeks. It resonated across the country. Articles about her story were published in major newspapers, and talk shows wanted to interview her. She became a symbol, a quiet yet powerful force, showing others what it meant to rise from the ashes of family betrayal. But even as the accolades came, Margaret didn't change. She stayed grounded. She remained the same woman who had once believed her family was her everything, but who had learned to build her own life on her own terms. She'd started this journey in darkness, but now she was basking in a light she had long forgotten was hers to claim. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Vera. "I just finished your book. Your story is going to help so many. I'm proud of you, Margaret. Proud of the woman you've become." Margaret read the message and felt a soft warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't need anyone's validation except her own. She had already won, and that, in itself, was enough. As she sat back in her chair, the soft glow of the setting sun spilling through the window, Margaret knew she had finally found her freedom, and it was more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. The email arrived late on a Wednesday afternoon, slipping into Margaret's inbox like a quiet storm. It was from Clara's lawyer, a name she didn't recognize, but the message's intent was unmistakable. "Cease and desist." Margaret read the letter in full, her eyes skimming over the formal language and threats of legal action. Clara, it seemed, was trying to silence her, to stop the truth from spreading. The message was clear. Remove all mentions of her and Jacob from the blog or face a lawsuit for defamation. A cold, dry laugh bubbled up from within her. Clara truly believed that this was how it would end, by threatening Margaret into silence, by using her power to bully her into submission. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to silence her, but it was the first time it had come with such legal weight. The silence in Margaret's house felt suffocating, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry. She felt something deeper, something far more resolute than those emotions. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the final line of defense. She opened the letter again, her fingers pressing the keyboard with a calm determination as she drafted her response. Every word, every sentence was measured, controlled. She wasn't going to give Clara or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. A few minutes later, she clicked send, a final declaration of her refusal to back down, and then, without hesitation, Margaret published the cease and desist letter on her blog. The letter was redacted for privacy, of course. Clara's personal details blurred out for legal protection, but the message was loud and clear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard once more as she added a short, pointed message beneath the post. To those who would silence the truth, you cannot erase what has already been said. The words are out there, and I will not take them back. What was done to me will not be hidden any longer. She hit publish and leaned back in her chair, her chest tight, but her resolve unshaken. The blog comments began to pour in almost immediately. We stand with you, Margaret. Your strength is our strength. Thank you for speaking the truth. Clara can't silence you. You're a beacon for all of us. The flood of support from her readers was immediate and overwhelming. Strangers, some from far-off places, expressed their solidarity, shared their own stories of betrayal, and told Margaret they too were finding their voices, finding their strength. The words she had written had gone viral, touching the hearts of people who felt, for the first time, that they weren't alone. A soft knock at the door pulled Margaret from the glow of her computer screen. She stood up and opened it, her breath catching slightly when she saw Lily standing there, a small bag in her hand, her face a picture of quiet warmth. Lily had become a constant in Margaret's life since the blog had taken off. Not only had she been a source of support, but she had also become a close friend. Someone who understood the pain of family betrayal. Someone who had gone through her own struggles, but who had always held on to the belief that things could get better. I saw your post, Lily said softly, her voice laced with admiration. I just wanted to tell you something. Something important. Margaret blinked, unsure of what Lily was going to say, but she felt an aching sense of gratitude. This woman, who had seen the ugliest side of family life, still chose to stand beside her. You're my real home, Margaret, Lily continued, her eyes shining with emotion. I've been following your journey from the beginning, and I want you to know, what you're doing is changing lives. You've given me hope, and I'm sure you've given so many others that same gift. The words landed in Margaret's heart like a weight lifting. It wasn't the validation of strangers on the internet that moved her. It was the quiet, heartfelt words of someone who truly understood. She smiled, her chest swelling with a sense of fulfillment that had eluded her for so long. Lily's presence felt like the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that confirmed Margaret was not just surviving anymore. She was thriving. The following weeks were a blur of excitement and press interviews. Margaret's blog had turned into a national phenomenon, the stories of betrayal, healing, and strength resonating far beyond her expectations. She was contacted by talk shows, newspapers, and magazines. It felt like the world was finally listening to the quiet voices of people who had been silenced by family and shame for too long. But in the midst of this whirlwind, a quiet storm was brewing behind the scenes. It came one Thursday morning, an email from an old friend, a journalist who had been following Margaret's story. The headline in the subject line read, "Breaking news, Clara's termination from company name." Margaret opened the email with a sinking feeling, her heart racing as she read the details. It turned out that Clara's ethical violations, the same manipulations she had tried to enforce through legal pressure against Margaret, had come to light. A series of anonymous complaints about her behavior, coupled with her involvement in unethical business practices, had finally reached the higher-ups at her company. Clara had been fired, dismissed publicly for her actions. Margaret stared at the screen, her hands shaking for the first time in weeks. She hadn't expected this, but part of her, the part that had never gotten the justice she'd deserved, couldn't help but feel a sharp sense of satisfaction. She wasn't the only one who had paid the price for her actions. Clara was being exposed for the woman she truly was. Margaret sighed deeply, not sure how to feel. But one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. Clara had tried to silence her, tried to control the narrative, but now she was being forced to confront the very consequences she had tried to avoid. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind heavy with the weight of the news. The journey she had started years ago had brought her here, far from the pain of betrayal, standing in the light of truth. And now, she knew that the power of her story wasn't just in what had happened, but in what was still to come. The story wasn't over. Not yet. The papers were spread out before Margaret, each one a symbol of the life she had worked for, the decisions she had made, the future she was finally securing for herself and Grace. The room was quiet, the only sound the scratch of her pen as she carefully signed each document. There was a certain satisfaction in the action. Each signature, each clause, finalized, was another small victory in a journey that had once seemed so uncertain. She had started with nothing but heartbreak and betrayal, but now, Margaret had something that mattered more than anything Jacob or Clara could ever take from her. Control. Control over her legacy. Control over what she would leave behind. Control over who would carry on the things that mattered most. Her eyes flickered over the final will, a document that would ensure Grace's future was protected, that she would never have to worry about the same mistakes that had poisoned Margaret's life. She had arranged a trust for Grace, one that would provide her with a future filled with opportunities, free from the toxic ties that had held Margaret back for so long. A scholarship in Grace's name would fund her education, the money coming from assets Margaret had carefully and strategically invested over the years. She had ensured that Jacob and Clara would never touch a dime of it. This was Grace's legacy, the reward for a girl who had never once turned her back on Margaret, even when everyone else had. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking her focus. It was an email from Amber. Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it, already knowing what it would say. Amber, Clara's best friend, always had an angle. "Margaret, I know things have been rough, but we need to move past this. I'm trying to fix things for Clara. I think it's time we all just let it go. Please, let's work things out. For the sake of the family." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She let the words sit in her mind for a moment. A cold reminder of how everything had been twisted, how Amber had always been a part of the same effort to control the narrative, to paint Clara and Jacob in a better light, while Margaret was left in the shadows. She had no interest in fixing things. Amber's words felt empty. She had tried to manipulate Margaret before, tried to make her feel guilty for not letting things slide. But Margaret wasn't the same woman who had been dragged along by the whims of her son and daughter-in-law. She was stronger now. The past was gone. Her family was gone. And she was finally free. She deleted the email without replying and turned her attention back to the papers in front of her. Her legacy was set. It was secure. And it was her own. A few moments later, another notification popped up on her phone, this time from Mark. His name made her pause. She had not heard from him in months. Mark had been the one person who had always tried to bridge the gap between her and Jacob. But even he had proven that he was ultimately more concerned with family appearances than standing up for what was right. The subject of the email read, "Apology. Margaret, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I didn't see it at the time, but now I know I should have stood by you. I know I can't fix what's been broken, but please know that I regret how things went down. Margaret read the email through twice, her face unreadable. The apology was too little, too late. She had waited for years for Jacob to come to this realization, but now she knew that this was just another attempt to fix things from the outside in, without truly understanding the damage that had been done. She typed her response slowly, deliberately, her fingers steady on the keyboard. Your apology is noted, but it doesn't change anything. I've made my peace with the decisions I've had to make, and I won't be revisiting the past. I've moved on. It's time for you to do the same. She hit send, her finger lingering on the mouse for a moment longer than necessary. No more second chances. No more waiting. This was the last time she would entertain empty gestures. The email sent, Margaret turned her attention back to the final piece of the puzzle. The document she had just signed, her last act of ensuring that her wealth, her hard-earned legacy, would never fall into the hands of those who had taken so much from her. Her attorney had confirmed everything, double-checking each clause for loopholes that Jacob or Clara might try to exploit. They would be excluded from everything. Grace would inherit it all. And then, a thought crossed her mind, a final step to make sure there were no loose ends. Margaret pulled out the last document, one she had been holding off on, the legal notice of full disinheritance. She hadn't wanted to send it. She had hoped, foolishly, that Jacob would show some semblance of remorse, that he would come to her of his own accord and apologize for everything. But he hadn't. And so, it was time. Her fingers moved without hesitation, the weight of the decision lightening her chest. She clicked send. The notification confirmed the document had been received by their legal team. The feeling of closure settled over her in that moment. Clara would try one more time, Margaret knew it. But nothing would change now. No more apologies. No more second chances. Margaret stood up, her gaze steady as she walked over to the window, looking out at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, she saw the world before her, wide open with possibility. And she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, no one could ever take this away from her. Her legacy was hers alone to claim. Margaret's hand hovered over the cup of tea, her fingers circling the handle in slow, deliberate motions as she stared out the window. The house was still, but the quiet felt different now. Familiar, yes, but also filled with something else. She had built this life for herself, step by step, each decision final and unyielding. She had moved on, but the past, like a shadow, still lingered. The knock on the door came unexpectedly, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. Margaret glanced toward the door, her breath catching for a moment. She already knew who it was. She had known this moment was coming. Her steps were measured, but she moved without hesitation. When she opened the door, Mark was standing there, his posture stiff but his eyes filled with something unspoken. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or the weight of what they had both lost. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking almost smaller than she remembered. He had never been someone who had been able to confront things head-on, but Margaret had expected him to do more than this. She had expected more from him. "Margaret," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I messed up. I should have stood up for you." The words were simple, but they landed with a quiet heaviness. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The years of resentment, of waiting for him to choose her, to see her, had worn her down. She had spent too long in that place, hoping he would be the one to fix it. But he hadn't. She let his words hang in the air, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on her. There had been a time when she would have rushed to console him, when she would have offered the words he needed to hear. But not now. Not anymore. You said everything, she replied, her voice even, but unwavering. Just not with your actions. His eyes flinched, but he didn't look away. She could see the conflict in him, the effort to bridge the gap between them, but she wasn't interested in hearing the excuses. She had heard them all before. This conversation wasn't about them, it was about her, about the closure she had finally reached. Mark shifted uncomfortably, as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. He opened his mouth, but she raised her hand, stopping him before he could speak. You don't get to fix this with words, Mark, she said quietly. It's done. It's been done for a long time. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, Margaret almost felt sorry for him. But then she remembered how he had never truly fought for her, never stood by her when she needed him the most. He had chosen sides, and it hadn't been hers. I just want a chance to make it right, he pleaded, his voice raw, vulnerable. To make amends. Please. I know I failed you. Margaret met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She didn't feel anger, but there was no forgiveness left in her heart. Not for him. Not for anyone who had turned their back on her when she needed them the most. I don't need you to fix anything, she said, her tone quiet but resolute. I've made my peace. You should make yours. Mark didn't reply at first. His head bowed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in resignation. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway. She watched him go, but she didn't feel the closure she thought she would. Instead, there was only a sense of finality. This was it. The last thread connecting her to the past had been severed. As she closed the door behind her, Margaret exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her chest release. The journey had come to an end, but she knew something important had shifted within her. It wasn't about the apologies. It was about standing firm in the decisions she had made and letting go of the people who had never truly understood her worth. She turned back to the table, where her phone sat buzzing quietly. The email notification from Gina caught her eye. Margaret, I just wanted to update you on the royalties from your book. The response has been incredible. You're making a real impact. This is just the beginning. A small smile tugged at the corner of Margaret's lips. She had written her story not to make others feel sorry for her, but to give others the courage to speak their truths too. And it was working. She picked up the phone, quickly typing a response. Thank you, Gina. Let's keep pushing forward. The world needs more of these stories. Margaret paused for a moment after hitting send, her fingers lingering on the screen. There was a sense of peace that had settled within her, an understanding that her journey wasn't just about what had been taken, but what she had reclaimed. Mark had left, but in doing so, he had given her the one thing she had longed for: closure. And with that, Margaret knew that the chapter she had spent so long trying to close was finally, irrevocably, done. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from Clara. Family is still family, Margaret. We can't keep pretending this isn't something we can work through. Margaret stared at the words, and for a moment she thought about replying. But then she smiled, a real smile, and deleted the message without another thought. Some things were better left unsaid. And as she sat back, the soft hum of her phone at her side, Margaret knew. The future was wide open now. Her legacy was hers to shape, and it would be nothing like the one they had tried to force upon her. It was her turn to create something new. The story, after all, was hers to write. The quiet hum of the printer filled the room, the steady click of the machine marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Joanne sat at her desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she reread the final draft of her obituary. The words were simple, but they were everything she needed them to be. It was a farewell, a way to make her exit from the world on her own terms. She had spent days agonizing over it. The obituary had always been a place to honor the life you had lived, to leave a legacy of who you were. But Joanne wasn't going to follow tradition. She wasn't going to write about the family she had raised, the one that had crumbled under the weight of betrayal and neglect. No, her obituary was going to reflect the truth she had fought so hard to reclaim. Her eyes lingered on the last line, where she had named only one person: Grace. Joanne Fields, beloved mother, grandmother, and advocate. Survived by her granddaughter, Grace Fields, who broke the cycle. The finality of it hit her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had thought in moments of weakness about how things could have been different, about the family she had once dreamed of. But now, as she looked at the name she had chosen to leave behind, she felt a profound sense of peace. Grace had been her constant. Grace had given her the love and support she had longed for, and it was Grace who would carry her legacy forward, free from the shackles of the past. Joanne printed the document, the soft clink of the printer's final click echoing in the room. It was done. She wasn't going to give Jacob or Clara any space in this narrative. They were part of a past she was determined to leave behind. The next few days were filled with finalizing the rest of her plans. Joanne had established a writing grant in her late husband's name, one dedicated to those who were healing from the wounds of family betrayal. It felt fitting. Her husband had always believed in second chances, in the power of words to heal. Now, she was using their combined legacy to help others like herself. People who had been cast aside and left in the shadows, people who had to fight to find their voice. But it wasn't just about giving money. It was about giving people the opportunity to speak, to share their stories, to heal through writing. Joanne believed deeply in that power now. She had seen it firsthand with her blog, with her own journey of reclaiming her life. She was giving others the tools to rewrite their own narratives, to leave behind the chains that had once bound them. With that done, she moved into a new home, small but warm, full of light. She had sold the house where so many memories of betrayal and heartache had lived. That house, with its empty rooms and broken promises, was gone. This new house was everything she needed. It was a fresh start, a place where she could create her own peace, her own sanctuary. She decorated it simply, with soft colors and plants that would grow, a reminder that life could begin again even in the most unexpected places. Joanne stood in the center of the living room, arms crossed, taking it all in. This was her life now. Nothing to do with the past, nothing to do with the people who had never truly understood her. She had built something new, something all her own. A few weeks later, Joanne found herself speaking at a cancer survivor brunch. She had been invited to share her story, to inspire others who had walked the same path of illness, pain, and healing. At first, she had hesitated. She had shared her story in her blog, and now the book was out in the world, gaining attention. But this was different. This was live. This was a room full of people who needed to hear something real, something raw. She stood in front of the microphone, the room quiet as she began. When you're in the dark, when you feel like you've lost everything, it's hard to believe that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But sometimes, the hardest thing you'll ever do is let go. Letting go of people, of the family you thought would always be there. But once you do, once you break free, you realize something. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. You realize that you were never truly lost. You were always there, waiting for the chance to finally live your life for yourself. Her voice wavered for only a moment, but she didn't falter. She had never spoken so openly before, but it was right. It was time. She finished the speech with a sense of pride, a quiet peace settling within her. As the crowd began to applaud, one woman in the front stood and raised her hand, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "I did the same," she said. "I left. I cut the ties. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm here, and I'm not broken anymore." Joanne smiled, the warmth spreading through her chest. She had helped her. She had made a difference. And in that moment, she knew her journey was more than just her own. It was about showing others how to stand up for themselves, how to break free from the people who had never valued them. After the event, Joanne received messages, emails, and texts from people all over the country who had found her story and her message in their own lives. Some told her they had finally walked away from toxic relationships. Others said they had started writing their own stories. It was all she had ever wanted, to give people the courage to leave behind what no longer served them and to step into a future that was theirs to create. As Joanne returned to her new home that evening, the sun setting in the distance, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was a sense of peace, true peace. The past was behind her. The family she had left behind, Jacob, Clara, was part of a different story now. A story she no longer needed to carry. She took a seat by the window, looking out at the horizon. It was her future now, and she would write it the way she wanted. It was her turn to build something real, something strong, and something lasting. Grace had broken the cycle, and Joanne, in her own way, had done the same. The story, after all, was hers to finish. The cancer center gleamed in the early morning light, its modern design a stark contrast to the gritty hospitals Joanne had once known. She stood at the entrance, her fingers brushing the smooth glass doors, feeling the weight of everything that had led her to this moment. The center, built in part by her donations, was a tangible reminder of what she had fought for. The quiet legacy she had begun building now had a face, a structure, something that would outlast her in ways her family never could. Inside, the walls were lined with beautiful murals of peaceful landscapes, a far cry from the sterile, unfeeling corridors of the places she had once spent her time. It was warm here, vibrant. This was a place of healing, not just for the body, but for the spirit. She walked through the lobby, each step echoing softly on the polished floors. There, in a quiet corner by the windows, was a plaque, its engraving catching the light just right. Joanne approached it slowly, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words carved in polished metal. "For the survivors of spite, Joanne Fields." Her breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined her name would be here, etched for all to see. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of her financial contribution, it was a testament to something deeper. To the woman who had endured betrayal, loss, and heartache, and yet still found the strength to create something lasting, something that would help others. She ran her fingers lightly over the letters, the cold metal warm beneath her touch, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. "Thank you," she whispered to the plaque, to the survivors who would walk through these doors, to the woman who had made this possible. A soft sound from behind caught her attention. She turned and saw Grace walking toward her, her art portfolio tucked under her arm. Grace's face was flushed with the glow of excitement, her steps light, yet purposeful. Joanne's heart swelled in her chest, her pride for the young woman she had raised filling every corner of the room. Grace had grown into someone strong, someone who had taken the broken pieces of her past and molded them into something beautiful. As she approached, she opened the portfolio, revealing the sketches she had been working on, vibrant colors, intricate designs, each piece a reflection of her soul. "These are for you, Grandma," Grace said, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "I wanted you to see what I've been working on." Joanne knelt beside her, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the first drawing, a landscape of the center itself, bathed in golden light. It was breathtaking, but more than that, it was an expression of gratitude, of growth, of everything Grace had become. "You've always known how to capture beauty," Joanne said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at her granddaughter, her smile wide and proud. "I'm so proud of you, Grace, more than words can say." Grace beamed, the joy in her eyes mirrored by the way her entire face lit up. "You taught me how to do that, Grandma. You showed me that no matter what happens, we can create something good from the bad." Joanne felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not here, not now. Instead, she pulled Grace into a tight embrace, feeling the weight of all the years, all the sacrifices, all the healing they had done together. When they pulled apart, Grace smiled and handed Joanne one last piece, a portrait of herself, sitting in front of the cancer center, the sun shining down on her, a symbol of hope. Joanne stared at it, her chest tightening with the rawness of the moment. "This is what I leave behind," Joanne whispered, her hand trembling as she gently placed the portrait on the table between them. You are my legacy." Later that evening, Joanne sat at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand. The house was quiet, but there was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. Gina had just delivered the final legacy binder, documents, plans, and all the legalities wrapped up neatly. It was the last step in securing Grace's future, ensuring she would never be left to face the world without the tools she needed to thrive. Gina raised her glass, her smile as soft and knowing as ever. "To your legacy, Joanne. To everything you've built." Joanne met her gaze, her own smile forming slowly. She had always known the road would be long and the losses painful. But this peace, this quiet strength, was the reward. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of rebuilding what had been torn apart. "To new beginnings," Joanne said, her voice steady, her heart light. "To the stories we choose to write for ourselves." They clinked their glasses, the sound a soft echo in the quiet kitchen. The house around them seemed to hum with possibility, with the promise of more, a future that wasn't defined by what had been lost, but by what had been gained. Joanne gazed out the window as the last light of the day faded into night. The journey had been hard, but she had finally arrived at a place where peace didn't feel like an illusion. It felt real. It felt earned. And as she sat there, in the quiet comfort of the home she had built, with Grace's art displayed proudly on the walls, she knew that this was the true meaning of legacy. Not the bloodline that had betrayed her, but the love she had fostered, the lessons she had passed on, and the strength she had found. Her future was wide open, and it was beautiful. The story, after all, was hers to write, and she was only just getting started. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting soft golden light across the room. Joanne sat in the hard plastic chair, watching Grace from the crowd, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. The college orientation had begun in earnest, and Grace, her granddaughter, her legacy, was taking her first steps into a new world. The campus was alive with excitement, the air buzzing with the energy of new beginnings. Joanne's eyes followed Grace as she mingled with her new classmates, a group of strangers who would soon become like family. Grace was confident, her posture strong, her smile radiant. She belonged here, and as Joanne watched, she realized just how far they had both come. She had been so afraid, years ago, that Grace would inherit the same wounds she had carried for far too long. But no, Grace had broken the cycle. She had carved her own path, one that was bright and filled with possibility. Joanne's heart swelled with a quiet joy, knowing that no matter what came next, Grace was going to be okay. Behind Joanne, Vera sat quietly, her hand resting gently on Joanne's shoulder. They had both come so far, together. And now, it was time to celebrate this new chapter. There was a strength in the silence they shared, a bond forged through shared pain and triumph. Vera had been there through it all. Her unwavering support, a constant in Joanne's life, reminding her that the love of a true friend could fill the emptiness left behind by betrayal. As the speakers at the event droned on, Joanne's mind drifted back to her own journey. She had survived the worst, rebuilt herself piece by piece, and now, here she was, watching her granddaughter begin the life she had always dreamed of for her. It was a life full of possibility, untainted by the toxicity that had once surrounded her. A voice from the podium broke through her thoughts. The speaker had just quoted something from Joanne's blog. Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal, but your legacy begins with love. The words echoed in Joanne's chest, a reminder of the truth she had come to understand. Family, blood, had never been her true source of strength. It had always been the love she had cultivated, the relationships she had chosen, that had carried her through. And now, watching Grace, seeing her stand tall in the world, Joanne knew that she had created something lasting, something beautiful. The event ended, and Grace rushed over to Joanne, her arms open, ready for a hug. Joanne smiled, her heart full. The warmth of the moment, the bond between them, was everything. Grace's joy radiated in waves, and Joanne felt a quiet peace wash over her as she embraced her granddaughter. Later, as they walked to the car, Grace spoke excitedly about the people she had met, the classes she was looking forward to. Joanne listened intently, but inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something permanent and beautiful. The world was open to Grace now. Joanne had done her part. When the day wound down, Joanne found herself walking back to her new home, the familiar glow of the porch lights lighting the path before her. She had lived a lifetime in the years that had passed since she'd first felt the crushing weight of betrayal. And now, there was a quiet finality to it all. As she stepped inside, the comforting scent of her home wrapped around her, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The walls, filled with the art Grace had created, the plants that thrived in every corner, were all symbols of the new life she had built. It was hers, untouched by the hands of those who had once claimed to love her but hadn't known how to do it. Joanne poured herself a cup of tea, settling into her chair by the window. The evening had come, and with it, the stillness that felt so right. The world outside was dark, the sounds of the night drifting in through the open window. She took a sip of her tea, reflecting on the path that had led her here. The pain, the heartache, it had all shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She had become someone new, someone stronger. Someone who had reclaimed her life and her future. And as she sat there, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this moment, she picked up her journal. The words flowed freely, a final entry in the book she had been writing all these years. I survived twice, she wrote, her hand steady, her heart light. She paused for a moment before adding the last line. When they handed me trash bags, I handed them the paper that showed their name removed. Joanne closed the journal, her heart full of peace. It was done. She had lived her truth, had embraced the life she chose. She had broken free, not just from the people who had betrayed her, but from the chains of a past that no longer had a place in her future. As she finished her tea and set the cup aside, the house felt like home, finally. Quiet, full of love, and filled with the promise of a future that was hers to define. The story was hers to write, and it was only just beginning.